I should have known the moment I saw the way his fingers hesitated before brushing mine, like he was afraid my touch might stain him. But love makes you stupid, doesn't it? Or maybe it's not love at all, just the desperate hope that if you stand still long enough, someone will finally see you. Daniel never really saw me, not the way he saw her. Sophia was the kind of name that sounded like a love song, the kind of woman who left perfume in the air long after she'd walked away. And when she came back, 5 years after vanishing to marry some finance guy in London, it was like the universe had hit rewind on Daniel's heart. I watched it happen in slow motion, the way his breath caught when her name flashed on his phone, the way he accidentally ran into her at that coffee shop they used to go to, the way his voice softened when he said, "She's just going through a hard time." As if divorce was a tragedy, and not the natural consequence of being the kind of person who leaves wreckage in their wake. I played the understanding girlfriend because what else was I supposed to do? Throw a fit? Demand he block her? I wasn't that girl. Except, here's the joke, she was. Sophia called him at midnight, drunk and crying about how she'd wasted her youth, and he rushed over like she'd summoned him with a bat signal. I sat on our couch, staring at the takeout I'd ordered for us, and wondered if he'd even remember I existed by sunrise. He came back at 3 a.m, smelling like her lavender perfume and cheap whiskey. "She's just lost," he said, like that excused everything. Like I was supposed to nod and say, "Of course, baby. Go comfort your ex-wife while I reheat your dinner for the 3rd time." The worst part? I almost did, but then came the night. Capital letters, because some moments carve themselves into your bones. We were at a party, some corporate thing where I'd spent an hour picking out a dress just for him to glance at me twice. Sophia showed up uninvited, draped in red silk and regret. And Daniel? He looked at her like she'd hung the moon. I watched from the sidelines as she tripped into his arms, as he whispered something that made her laugh as his hand lingered on her waist a second too long. And then, because the universe has a sick sense of humour, she caught my eye over his shoulder, smiled. Not the sweet, innocent kind, the kind that said, "I could take him from you right now if I wanted." I didn't wait to find out if she was right. I left. No scene, no tears. Just me, my dignity, and the quiet understanding that I'd never be anyone's first choice. Turns out that was the best thing that ever happened to me. I perfected the art of swallowing words. When Daniel sat me down with trembling hands and said, "We need to talk," I already knew the script. I could see it in the way his eyes darted to his phone, Sophia's name lighting up the screen again, and in the guilty slant of his shoulders, like he was carrying the weight of a choice he'd already made. "I think I need to figure things out," he said, as if love were a puzzle and not a grenade. I could have screamed. I could have thrown his favourite mug against the wall and watched it shatter the way my ribs were shattering inside my chest. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled. Small, understanding, the kind of smile that hides teeth, and said, "I want you to be happy." The lie tasted like blood. I helped him pack, folded his shirts the way he liked them, tucked his favourite book into his duffel bag, even reminded him to grab his charger. Every movement was a performance, a pantomime of grace under fire. He kept staring at me like he expected me to crumble, like he needed my tears to justify what he was doing. But I refused to give him that. The night he left, Sophia texted him a photo. Just a sunset, innocuous enough, but the caption read, "Remember this view?" And he did. Of course he did. I watched his face soften, watched him type back something wistful, and in that moment, I understood. I wasn't losing him. He was never mine to begin with. When he proposed to her 6 months later, I sent a congratulations text. 1 sentence, no exclamation points. "Wishing you both the best." Sophia replied within minutes, "Thank you for understanding true love." I laughed so hard I choked. At their wedding, I wore blue. something about old rhymes and new beginnings. But really, it was because I knew it brought out my eyes. Let him look. Let him remember what he walked away from. I drank champagne that burned going down and made small talk with people who pitied me, their voices dripping with sympathy they didn't mean. "You're so brave," someone whispered. Brave? No. Brave would have been walking out the second I realised I was the understudy in my own life. Brave would have been burning the whole thing down instead of letting them rewrite my ending. But I didn't. I just left before the cake was cut, slipping out like a ghost. No goodbyes, no scene, just the quiet click of the door behind me, and the hollow understanding that sometimes the noblest lie is the one you tell yourself. The champagne flute slipped from my fingers at exactly midnight, not from drunkenness, but from perfect precision. The crystal shattered against marble in a discordant chime that no one heard over the orchestra's swell. A fitting metaphor, really. I didn't make a production of my exit. No dramatic door slams or tear-streaked goodbyes. Just a slow retreat into the shadows of the ballroom, my heels silent on the Persian rug they'd chosen together. The scent of gardenias and regret hung heavy in the air as I passed their sweetheart table, where Sophia's manicured fingers were already tracing possessive circles on Daniel's wrist. The valet blinked when I requested my car. "Leaving so soon, miss?" His pitying glance toward the reception hall said everything. I handed him a folded 50 between two fingers. Some parties aren't worth staying for. My apartment smelled like packing tape and endings when I returned. 2 suitcases by the door held everything worth keeping. The cashmere sweater I bought myself after Daniel forgot my birthday. The first edition novel Lucian had pressed into my hands during our last meeting. The passport I'd renewed but never used. I left my engagement ring in the freezer. Let Daniel find it someday when he went looking for ice cubes for Sophia's cocktails. The poetic justice almost made me smile. The Uber to the airport arrived at 1:17 a.m. As we merged onto the highway, my phone lit up with Daniel's caller ID. I watched it ring until the screen went dark, then rolled down the window and let the night air steal my breath away. The city didn't care that my heart had been ripped out. Taxis still honked, neon signs still flickered, and the espresso machine at the corner cafe still hissed like an angry cat at 7 a.m. I learned this through bloodshot eyes on my 3rd morning in the new apartment, counting change for coffee with fingers that still smelled like wedding champagne. The temp agency sent me to a startup called Blackthorn Innovations on a Tuesday. The elevator doors opened to reveal a bullpen of glass-walled offices, where young executives spoke too fast and laughed too loud. My cubicle faced a blank wall, appropriate since no one looked at me anyway. I filed invoices and answered phones with the mechanical precision of someone who'd left their soul in another zip code. Lucian Black's name first crossed my desk on a post-it note. "Fix these numbers before the 3 p.m. meeting." The spreadsheet swam before my eyes, columns of red ink bleeding across quarterly reports. I worked through lunch, rewriting formulas until the total sang. At 2:58 p.m, I slid the corrected file under his assistant's door and went back to being invisible. Until the next morning. "You!" The voice cut through the office chatter like a knife. Lucian stood in my cubicle entrance, 6'3" of tailored Italian wool and icy scrutiny. He held up my spreadsheet. "These projections are wrong." My stomach dropped. Then he smirked. "They're too conservative. You undersold us by 20%. He tossed a keycard on my desk. "Conference room, now." The meeting lasted 4 hours. Lucian dissected our competitors with surgical precision while I sat mute in the corner until he suddenly turned to me. "Mercer, what's the play?" All eyes swung my way. My mouth opened without permission. "We let them buy the failing subsidiary, then gut them when they're overextended." The words tasted bitter and perfect. Silence. Then Lucian's slow grin. Finally, he said, someone who understands this isn't tiddlywinks. That night, I stared at my darkened apartment ceiling, replaying the way power had coursed through me when Lucian nodded at my suggestion. It felt dangerously close to being alive again. The next week, he moved me to the executive floor. My new office had a window overlooking the city that had swallowed me whole. Sometimes, when the light hit just right, I could almost see my reflection instead of just the ghost I'd been. Midnight oil became my addiction. While the office emptied, I remained, fingers flying across keyboards, devouring reports others skimmed, tracing patterns in market fluctuations like a fortune teller reading tea leaves. The cleaning staff learned to work around me, their vacuums humming lullabies to my insomnia. Lucian started leaving his office door open. Some nights, I'd catch his silhouette watching from the threshold, the glow of my monitor reflecting in his sharp features. He never commented on my late hours, just began leaving case files on my desk with post-its, bearing single words. Thoughts, fix this. Impressive. The last one made my pulse skip. I stopped dreaming about Daniel, started dreaming in spreadsheets and strategy, waking with solutions scribbled on my skin in pen. My apartment gathered dust. My wardrobe became a rotation of 3 power suits. The barista downstairs memorized my order. Black coffee, no sugar, no life. The turning point came during the Halifax acquisition. The board was balking, the numbers didn't quite line up, and Lucian's usual ice-veined composure showed its first crack. I slid a folder across the table during the 11th hour meeting. Page 12, I murmured. Silence. Then, Lucian's knuckles went white around the papers. He stood so abruptly his chair toppled. We're taking the helicopter to Toronto tonight. Mercer, you're coming? At 30,000 feet, he handed me a whiskey neat. How did you see what my entire team missed? The amber liquid burned, going down as I explained the tax loophole buried in Canadian corporate law. His gaze never left my face, intensity like physical touch. You're wasted in analytics, he finally said. Starting tomorrow, you're my shadow. The elevator ride down to the parking garage that night felt different. When the doors opened, Lucian didn't move. You remind me of myself, he said quietly. All fire and no outlet. Then he was gone, leaving me standing there with my heart pounding like I'd run a marathon. I started carrying mints in my pocket after that, the kind that burned your tongue if you held them too long. A reminder, pleasure and pain often wear the same face. The first time I walked into a negotiation wearing a 5-figure dress, the room stuttered. Silk whispered against my thighs as I took Lucian's usual seat at the head of the table, my new Cartier watch catching the light. The opposing counsel's eyes darted between me and the empty chair beside me. Where's Mr. Black? I smiled slow and razor-edged. He sends his regards. Then I slid the amended contract across the polished mahogany. But this is my deal now. Lucian had me start attending his black tie events, not as staff but on his arm. Society pages called me his protégé, with arched eyebrows until the night a reporter asked point-blank about our relationship. Lucian's arm tightened around my waist as he deadpanned, I don't sleep with my investments. The resulting champagne I sipped tasted sweeter, knowing how many careers that quote would end. My signature evolved from shaky to sweeping. My voice stopped cracking when giving orders. My reflection in skyscraper windows finally matched the woman in my head. The final test came when Lucian threw a set of keys on my desk, to a corner office with his name still on the door. Time to stop playing apprentice, was all he said. The morning of my first solo takeover, I found a black velvet box in my new office. Inside gleamed a platinum keycard to the executive elevator and a note in familiar sharp handwriting. No more looking up, only forward. That night, standing at my floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights flicker to life, I realised I couldn't remember the last time I'd thought about blue dresses or broken champagne flutes. The invitation arrived on thick cream-coloured cardstock, embossed with gold foil that caught the light like a dare. The annual Whitmore Charity Gala, black tie required. I hadn't set foot in that city in 5 years, hadn't walked its streets, breathed its air, or let its ghosts whisper my name. But Lucien, ever the strategist, had already laid out the reasons why we should attend. Market expansion, political connections, the usual chess moves. He didn't mention Daniel or Sophia, he didn't have to. I ran my thumb over the engraving, feeling the ridges beneath my skin. You think I'm ready? Lucien didn't look up from his tablet. I think you stopped needing my approval 3 promotions ago. The private jet touched down at sunset, the city skyline stretching before us like a challenge. My reflection in the window was unfamiliar, sharper, colder, a woman who had traded apologies for authority. The last time I'd been here, I'd left with 2 suitcases and a shattered heart. Tonight, I stepped onto the tarmac in custom Louboutins, an address that cost more than Daniel's first car. The gala was held at the Whitmore Grand, the same hotel where I'd once attended a friend's wedding alone, because Daniel had suddenly remembered a work commitment. The irony wasn't lost on me. Lucien's hand settled at the small of my back as we entered the ballroom, his touch both an anchor and a brand. Heads turned, not just because of who he was, but because of who I'd become. The whispers started immediately. That's Eleanor Mercer. No, Elena Black now. I heard she orchestrated the Halifax deal single-handedly. Wasn't she engaged to Daniel Whitmore before? And then, as if summoned by the universe's cruel sense of humour, I saw them. Daniel stood near the champagne fountain, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his smile perfectly hollow. Sophia clung to his arm, her once radiant beauty now hardened at the edges, her laughter a little too loud, her grip on him a little too tight. They hadn't noticed me yet. Lucien leaned down, his breath warm against my ear. Do you want to leave? I didn't, because for the first time in years, I realised I wasn't afraid of them seeing me. I was excited for them to see exactly what they'd lost. I reached for a flute of champagne, the bubbles catching the light like tiny fireworks. Then I took Lucien's arm and stepped forward, right into their line of sight. Daniel's glass froze halfway to his lips. Sophia's smile slipped. And I? I smiled back. The moment Daniel's glass hit the floor, the room's chatter stuttered like a skipped record. Crystal, shattered against marble, in a discordant chime that drew every eye, except mine. I kept mine locked on his, watching the realization crawl across his face like a slow-motion car crash. Elena? His voice cracked on the second syllable. Sophia's grip on his arm turned possessive, her French tip nails digging into his sleeve. Darling, you're spilling your drink. Her tone was sugar-coated arsenic, her gaze sweeping over me with calculated dismissal. Lucien's fingers twined with mine, his thumb brushing my knuckles in silent question. I squeezed back, once, twice, before stepping forward. Daniel? I let his name hang between us, weightless. No bitterness, no tremor. Just a simple acknowledgement, the way one might greet a stranger at a business luncheon. He looked older. The boyish charm that once made my stomach flutter had hardened into something tired. The lines around his eyes deeper than they should have been at 32. His mouth opened, then closed, like a fish gasping for air. Sophia recovered first. How unexpected to see you here. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I heard you moved to New York. Briefly, I sipped my champagne. Though I suppose you heard many things. A muscle jumped in Daniel's jaw. Eleanor, Mr. Whitmore. Lucien materialized at my side, extending his hand. Your foundation's work with pediatric hospitals is admirable. The pause was deliberate, the unspoken, if underwhelming, hanging in the air. Daniel shook on autopilot, his gaze darting between us. You're her husband. Lucien's smile was all teeth. But I'm sure you already knew that. Sophia's champagne flute trembled. Sophia's composure lasted precisely 17 minutes. I counted each one as she circulated the room, her laughter growing increasingly shrill, her glances toward our table more frequent. When she finally approached during the dessert course, her Valentino gown whispered across the floor like a warning. "Your husband seems attentive," she purred, nodding towards Lucian conversing with investors across the room. "Though I suppose rich men always are with their new toys." The raspberry coulis on my plate suddenly looked remarkably like blood. "How's married life treating you, Sophia? Still enjoying all those, what was it, true love perks?" Her smile tightened. "Daniel's been promoted twice since you left. We bought a house in, yes, the Colonial on Elmwood." I dabbed my lips with a linen napkin. I saw the foreclosure notice when we were reviewing local property acquisitions. Her champagne flute hit the table with a clatter. Several heads turned. Lucian chose that moment to return, sliding an arm around my waist. "Darling, the Tokyo investors are insisting you join us." His fingers brushed the small of my back, our silent signal for checkmate. Sophia's mask slipped completely then. "You bought our house?" "Not specifically." I stood, smoothing my dress. "Just the bank that owned it." The lie tasted sweet. "Small world, isn't it?" As we walked away, I heard the unmistakable sound of breaking stemware, followed by Daniel's hissed, "Not here." Lucian's chuckle vibrated against my shoulder. "Too easy," he murmured. I glanced back at Sophia's crumbling facade, at Daniel's panicked attempts at damage control. The sight stirred nothing in me. No satisfaction, no lingering hurt. Just the quiet realization that some victories matter less, the stronger you become. The gossip columns erupted like a well-timed detonation. By morning, photos of Sophia's very public meltdown had spread across every society blog. Her designer gown splattered with red wine, Daniel's face frozen in mortification, as hotel staff discreetly ushered them out. The headlines wrote themselves: "Whitmore heiress humiliated at charity gala," "Black's mysterious wife stuns former flame," "Is this the ultimate revenge story?" Lucian tossed the morning papers onto the breakfast table with a satisfied smirk. "I do love when the vultures do our work for us." But the real damage wasn't in the tabloids. It was in the emails flooding my inbox. Old acquaintance suddenly remembered my existence. Daniel's colleagues just happened to reach out about potential partnerships. Even Sophia's so-called friends slid into my DMs with thinly veiled offers to dish the dirt. The most surprising message came at 3:17 p.m, a meeting request from Daniel himself. The subject line simply read, "Please." I deleted it without responding. Lucian watched me do it from across the office, his expression unreadable. No curiosity about what he wants? I swiveled my chair toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the afternoon sun painted the city in gold. I already know what he wants. Forgiveness, absolution, a chance to explain. I tapped my nails against my coffee cup. But some debts aren't worth collecting. That night, as we boarded the jet home, my phone buzzed one final time. A news alert. Whitmore Corporation stock drops 8% following gala scandal. Lucian arched a brow when I showed him. "Pity," he deadpanned. I powered off my phone and leaned back in the plush leather seat, watching the city lights shrink beneath us. Some fires burned themselves out. Daniel started appearing where he shouldn't. First, outside my favourite cafe in Manhattan. Just a glimpse of him through the window, his collar turned up against the wind like some tragic romantic hero. Then, at a charity auction where he'd never shown interest before, bidding absurd amounts on wines he didn't drink. Each time, his eyes found mine with that same wounded look, as if I were the one who'd walked away. Lucian found it amusing. "He's like a bad sequel," he remarked one evening as we reviewed security footage of Daniel lingering outside our building, desperate for a plot twist. But the real spectacle was Sophia's unraveling. Her Instagram transformed overnight, first deleting all photos with Daniel, then posting cryptic quotes about betrayal, before finally sharing a staged paparazzi shot of her leaving a lawyer's office. The caption, "New Beginnings." The media pounced. Speculations about affairs, financial troubles, and impending divorce circulated like wildfire. I might have pitied her if not for the way she'd looked at me that night at the gala, like I was still the girl she could bulldoze without consequence. Then came the voicemail. Daniel's voice, rough with what might have been tears or whiskey. I made a mistake, a colossal, irreversible mistake. Just tell me how to fix this. I played it once, then erased it. Lucian, leaning against the doorframe, arched a brow. No dramatic monologue about karma? I shrugged. Karma doesn't need my help. And it didn't. Because the truth was, the cracks in their perfect facade had always been there. I just used to be the one straining to hold them together. Now? I got to watch them split wide open. The divorce papers hit the tabloids before the ink dried. Sophia's lawyers made sure of that, leaking every humiliating detail, from Daniel's alleged emotional neglect to his suspicious financial behaviours. The same society pages that once fawned over their fairy tale romance now dissected their collapse with surgical precision. I might have laughed if it weren't so painfully familiar. Daniel's final attempt to reach me came in the form of a handwritten letter delivered to my office. The expensive stationery still smelled like his cologne, that woodsy scent I'd once loved. I held it over the shredder for a full minute before dropping it in unopened. Lucian found me staring out my office window that evening, the city lights blurring through unshed tears I refused to acknowledge. He didn't offer platitudes, just pressed a tumbler of 25-year Macallan into my hand and said, "To burning bridges that deserve to collapse anyway." The clink of our glasses echoed in the quiet room. I expected to feel something. Triumph, vindication, even pity. But as I scrolled past another headline about the Whitmore divorce settlement, all I felt was nothing. The absence was more liberating than any revenge fantasy could have been. The next morning, I authorised the wire transfer for our newest acquisition, a boutique investment firm that happened to hold Daniel's family trust portfolio, not out of malice, simply because it was good business. Some stories don't need dramatic endings. Sometimes the most powerful statement is turning the page without glancing back. Rain sheeted against the penthouse windows the night the final email arrived. Daniel's family trust had accepted our acquisition terms. No counters, no negotiations. Just a sterile, professional confirmation from their lawyers that made my entire history with him feel like a business transaction. Which, perhaps, it always had been. Lucian stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching storm clouds swallow the skyline. "You're quiet," he observed, swirling his bourbon. I scrolled through the document one last time before hitting archive. I thought this moment would feel different. He didn't ask what I meant. Didn't need to. The man could read silences better than most people read words. We drank in comfortable stillness until the grandfather clock struck midnight. Then, Lucian reached into his breast pocket and produced 2 first-class tickets to Bali. "Your calendar's clear for 3 weeks. The sudden laugh that escaped me startled us both. "When did you—" "Last Tuesday." His thumb brushed my wrist. "Figured you'd either want to celebrate or forget. Either way, it required a beach." The rain slowed to a drizzle as I traced the embossed itinerary. No more boardrooms, no more headlines, no more ghosts wearing familiar faces. Just sunrises and salt water, and the kind of peace I'd stopped dreaming about years ago. I found Daniel's wedding band while packing, the one I'd kept in an old jewellery box as some twisted memento. It weighed nothing in my palm. The balcony railing was cool under my fingers as I let it slip into the darkness, listening for a splash that never came. Bali smelled like frangipani and second chances. I woke on our third morning to Lucian's side of the bed empty, his pillow cool. Through the villa's open doors, I spotted him waist-deep in the turquoise surf, his silhouette dark against the rising sun. Something about the way he stood, utterly still amidst the churning waves, made my breath catch. I found his journal on the nightstand, not snooping, just reaching for my sunglasses when the leather-bound book tumbled open to a page dated 2 years earlier. Hired EM today, sharp as shattered glass. If she's half as ruthless as her file suggests, she'll be running this company by Christmas. Pity about the ex-fiancé. Any man who trades diamonds for costume jewellery deserves what's coming. The ocean roared in my ears. All those late nights, those calculated promotions, the way he'd watched me dismantle competitors with barely concealed pride. It hadn't been about mentorship at all. Lucian dripped seawater onto the marble floor when he returned, his gaze flickering from the open journal to my face. He didn't apologise, didn't explain, just held out a sand dollar he'd plucked from the reef. Broken on one side, he murmured, tracing the jagged edge. Perfect on the other. I understood then. This wasn't a rescue, it was a recognition. We breakfasted on the terrace as the staff fussed over fresh mango and coffee. Somewhere across the ocean, Daniel's divorce would be finalising. Sophia would be plotting her comeback, and the world would keep spinning. But here there was only salt-kissed skin, and the quiet certainty that every broken thing had led me exactly where I belonged. The villa's infinity pool blended seamlessly with the ocean horizon, as if the world had been remade without edges. I floated on my back, the morning sun warming my skin, Lucian's journal now tucked safely in my beach bag. He was right. It hadn't been about saving me. It had been about recognising what I could become when someone finally stopped asking me to shrink. A shadow fell across the water. Lucian stood at the pool's edge, holding 2 glasses of something chilled and citrus bright. "You've been quiet," he said, handing me one. I took a slow sip, the tartness bursting across my tongue. Just thinking about how different my life could have been. He lowered himself into the water beside me, the ripples distorting our reflections. Better? Different, I corrected. Not worse, not better, just another path, another version of me who might still be waiting for apologies that would never come. Lucian's fingers brushed mine beneath the surface, a silent question. I turned my palm up to meet his. Some stories end with grand gestures, reunions, reconciliations, dramatic declarations. Ours wasn't that story. It was quieter, more certain. The kind of love built not on sweeping promises, but on the daily choice to stand beside someone who'd seen every crack in your armour and handed you the tools to repair it yourself. As the tide rolled in, I tipped my head back to the sky and let go of the last what-if I'd been clinging to. It floated away like sea foam, dissolving into nothing.